Leela was a quiet little girl who lived with her father on the edge of a lonely farming colony, a place where the land stretched wide and the sky carried the glow of 2 suns by day and endless stars by night, yet for all its beauty it felt empty, because her mother had passed away long ago and her father, Captain Elias, no longer smiled the way he once did, keeping himself busy with the farm and leaving Leela to wander the fields and the broken edges of the colony, where old ships lay abandoned like silent giants, their hulls cracked, their lights gone, but their shapes still whispering of the stars. It was on one such afternoon, when the wind carried the scent of dust and dry grass, that she noticed something unusual among the forgotten metal, a movement, quick but cautious, like someone hiding, and curiosity tugged her feet closer, though her heart thumped with both fear and excitement. For children on this colony were told to avoid strangers and never go near the ruins. Yet something inside her urged her not to run, pushing aside a jagged sheet of steel. She froze when her eyes fell upon a figure crouched in the shadows, tall yet fragile looking, wrapped in a tattered cloak that failed to hide skin that shimmered faintly under the dim light. Not like human skin at all, but softer, almost luminous. And when the figure turned its face toward her, she saw eyes unlike any she had ever seen, wide, glowing faintly with a silver light. Eyes that seemed full of stories and sorrows she could not understand. Eyes that should have made her scream, but instead only made her want to know more. For a long moment neither spoke, the alien watching her as though waiting for her to run. But Lila's small hands gripped her dress tightly, and instead of fleeing she whispered with a courage she did not know she had, "Are you lost?" And the figure's expression shifted, surprise flickering across features both beautiful and strange, lips parting as though unused to speech, voice soft yet trembling, when it finally answered, "I do not belong here." And that confession, so quiet and broken, did not frighten her but rather stirred something deep in her heart, for she too often felt that way since her mother had gone, as though she did not fully belong anywhere either. So instead of leaving she took a step forward, small but firm, and with a child's innocence she said the words that would change everything. "You need a home, my father needs a bride, and I need a mom." And the alien woman blinked as though struck, her cloak slipping to reveal slender hands with faint markings that pulsed like veins of light, hands that trembled as though she had forgotten how to hold on to anything. She did not answer, only stared at this fearless little girl who should not have trusted her. And yet Lila's gaze was steady, filled with a hope so pure it cut through the alien's fear. The silence of the ruins pressed in around them, broken only by the soft whistle of the wind. And though the alien's body tensed as if ready to vanish back into the shadows, something kept her there. Something about the innocence of a child's voice and the promise hidden in those words. Something that whispered that perhaps she did not have to keep running. Perhaps the universe had not fully abandoned her. Perhaps the small human girl saw more in her than an outcast hiding among wreckage. And so the alien stayed, her glowing eyes never leaving Leela. And Leela, sensing that this was not the end, but only the beginning, smiled softly as the suns dipped lower in the sky, painting the ruins in long shadows, while far away Elias worked in the fields, unaware that his daughter had just invited a stranger and exile from another world into their lives, a choice that would change their fate and the fate of many more, though none of them knew it yet. Leela could not stop thinking about the strange woman she had met among the abandoned ships, and every morning after finishing her small chores, she slipped away from the farmhouse with a small basket of bread, fruit, or whatever she could gather from the kitchen without her father noticing, her little boots crunching softly on the dry ground as she made her way back to the ruins, where she knew the alien would be waiting, or at least she hoped so, because part of her feared that the mysterious figure might vanish like a dream. But each time she arrived she found her still there, crouched in the shadows or sitting quietly with her cloak wrapped tight, watching the sky as if searching for something far away. And though she never asked for food, her hands shook when she accepted it, as though she had not eaten in days. Little by little, as the days stretched into weeks, the silence between them grew shorter, and the alien, whose name Leela finally learned was Soraya, began to speak more openly in her soft, trembling voice, telling pieces of her story in fragments that painted a picture of loneliness deeper, then Leela could fully understand how Soraya had once belonged to a proud people who valued strength and war, how she had been trained to fight but refused to carry out an order that would have harmed innocents, how that act of defiance branded her a traitor and forced her into exile, hunted by her own kind, cast adrift with nowhere to go, and how she had stumbled upon this world only because her ship had failed and she had hidden in the wreckage. For fear of being seen, Leela listened with wide eyes, her young mind unable to grasp the full weight of betrayal and war, but able to recognize pain when she saw it. And the more Soraya spoke, the more Lila's heart ached for her, until one afternoon, as the golden light of the twin suns poured over the broken ships, she took Soraya's hand in her small one and whispered words that seemed to rise from her heart. Without planning, "You don't have to be alone anymore. You can come with me. My father needs someone, and I need a mom." And though Soraya tried to smile at the child's innocent hope, her eyes shimmered with tears because she did not believe such a thing was possible. Not for someone like her, not after everything she had lost. Yet Lila's grip on her hand was so firm, so full of certainty, that Soraya felt something stir within her chest, something she had not felt in years. Hope, fragile but real. Still she hesitated, reminding herself that humans would fear her, that a soldier like Captain Elias would never welcome an alien stranger into his home. Yet each day Leela returned with more stories about her father, how he worked the land tirelessly, how he used to smile before grief stole it away, how he sat alone at night staring at the stars as though searching for something beyond them, and how he loved her more than anything, but did not know how to show it anymore. And as Soraya listened, she began to wonder if perhaps she and Elias were not so different, two souls scarred by loss, carrying wounds they could not heal on their own. The thought frightened her, as much as it warmed her, for it meant opening herself to something she might lose again. Yet Lila's unwavering kindness chipped away at her defenses until one evening, as shadows stretched long across the ruins, the girl tugged at her hand with surprising strength and whispered, "Come with me now, please, he will understand." And before Soraya could protest, she found herself being led across the dusty fields, toward a farmhouse glowing faintly with lamplight, her heart pounding with fear that she would be rejected, that she would frighten the man who lived there, that she would shatter the little girl's dream. Yet her feet moved forward anyway, because deep inside she wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a place where she could stop running. The wind carried the smell of soil and wheat as they neared the house, and Soraya's breath came uneven as though every step drew her closer to a judgment she could not escape. But Leela squeezed her hand and smiled up at her with such trust that she forced herself to keep walking until they reached the doorway where the shadow of Captain Elias filled the frame. Broad-shouldered and weary-eyed, a man who had known battle and loss. And the moment his eyes fell upon Soraya, his body stiffened, hand instinctively reaching toward the old rifle resting by the door. And Soraya froze, every instinct screaming to flee back into the night. But Leela stepped forward bravely and cried out, "Wait, Papa, don't be afraid. She needs us." And in that charged moment the air seemed to thicken with tension, the silence heavy with unspoken questions, as Elias's eyes flicked between his daughter's pleading face and the alien standing behind her, cloak half fallen to reveal strange luminous skin, a sight that both unsettled and intrigued him. And though his hand hovered near his weapon, his gaze lingered longer than he expected, catching the exhaustion in Soraya's stance, the quiet sorrow in her eyes, and something in his heart, long hardened by grief, stirred against his will. Still he said nothing, only watched, waiting to see what this alien would do, while Soraya's pulse hammered in her ears and she wondered if she had just made the gravest mistake of her life or the first step toward a future she had thought forever lost. Elias stood in the doorway with the weight of his rifle pressing against his hand, his sharp eyes fixed on the stranger his daughter had brought home. And for the first time in years his steady soldier's mind felt uncertain, because the figure before him was no ordinary wanderer, but something otherworldly, a tall woman with skin that shimmered faintly in the lamplight as though it carried its own glow, and eyes unlike any he had ever seen, silver and deep, eyes that spoke of pain and exile, but also of strength. yet he had lived long enough to know that appearances could deceive, and every instinct told him to protect his child. But then he looked down and saw Leela clutching the alien's hand, her small face lit with hope and determination, and his heart twisted because he had not seen that spark in her eyes for so long. Not since her mother's passing, not since grief had turned their home quiet and heavy, and though he wanted to demand answers, to send this stranger away before danger could follow, he could not bring himself to crush the fragile happiness his daughter seemed to have found. Still he remained cautious, his voice low and steady as he asked who she was, and when she gave her name Soraya, it rolled off her tongue with a softness that carried both dignity and sorrow, and Elias noted the way her shoulders sagged, not in weakness but in weariness, as though she carried years of running and hiding. And when she spoke of needing shelter, her words halting yet honest, he felt his resolve bend slightly, though suspicion lingered in every thought. For he had fought in wars against beings not unlike her, and had seen firsthand the devastation outsiders could bring. Yet there was something different here, something he could not easily dismiss, and against his better judgment he told her she could stay the night, but only in the barn, his tone firm as he warned her that any sign of threat would see her gone by morning. Soraya accepted without protest, her gaze lowering in quiet humility, and Leela beamed as though her father had granted the greatest gift, tugging Soraya toward the barn with childish excitement, while Elias watched them go, his chest heavy with doubt and questions he could not answer. Later, when the house grew silent and the fields outside whispered under the cold wind, he sat at the table staring at the flickering lamp, his calloused hands folded tightly as his mind turned over the events of the evening. What kind of father allowed an unknown alien near his daughter? What dangers could follow her? And yet what kind of man turned away someone so clearly lost and broken, someone who reminded him, in an unsettling way, of himself? Sleep eluded him that night, and when the first light of dawn touched the horizon he went out to the barn, moving quietly like a soldier on patrol. And what he saw stopped him in his tracks, Soraya kneeling beside broken farming tools, her delicate hands moving with precision as faint lines of light glowed beneath her skin, weaving through the metal as though breathing new life into it. And before his eyes, tools that had been useless for years were mended, stronger than before. And though part of him wanted to step forward and demand what she was doing, another part of him felt a spark of reluctant admiration, for she was not harming, she was healing, not destroying but repairing, and in that moment he understood that she was not here to take but perhaps to give. Still his doubts did not vanish, for trust was not built in a single night, and as he stepped forward, his boots crunching against the straw, Soraya looked up at him with eyes that did not flinch, eyes that seemed prepared for his anger or his suspicion. But instead of harsh words, Elias found himself asking why she would help when she owed them nothing. And her answer, soft but steady, was that helping made her feel less like the outcast she had been forced to become. That fixing something broken reminded her she was not only capable of harm, but of kindness, and those words struck him in a place he kept guarded, for he too knew what it was to feel broken, to feel as though pieces of himself had been lost with his wife. And though he said nothing, he turned away quickly, unwilling to let her see the conflict in his eyes. The days that followed were filled with the same unease, Soraya working quietly to repair things on the farm, Leela following her like a shadow, laughing more than Elias had heard in years. And though neighbors began to notice the presence of a strange figure near his land, whispering questions when they passed, he held his tongue, unsure whether to defend her or deny her, torn between the soldier who distrusted outsiders and the father who saw his daughter's joy returning. And each night as he sat alone he asked himself whether Soraya's presence was a danger or a gift, whether letting her stay would destroy them or save them. And the longer she remained, the less certain he became, his doubts growing heavier, not because she had done anything wrong, but because he feared how much his heart was beginning to soften, how much he was starting to want to believe that perhaps this stranger was not the enemy he once imagined, but something far more dangerous to a man who had sworn never to hope again. A chance at healing, asterisk. The days turned into weeks, and though Elias told himself that the alien woman would only be a temporary guest in the barn, her presence slowly spread into every corner of their lives. not in loud or forceful ways, but in small and quiet changes that he could not ignore. For each morning, when he stepped out to the fields, he found his tools neatly repaired and sharpened, the barn organized with a precision he himself had abandoned. And when storms came, she braved the rain to help secure the animals, her glowing hands working faster than his tired arms could manage. Yet she never asked for thanks and never sought reward, only bowed her head slightly when he looked her way, as though her place was always meant to be in the shadows. But Leela did not let her stay there, the child clinging to her every step, asking endless questions about the stars, about the languages Soraya spoke, about the strange symbols on her skin that glowed faintly when she was tired. And Soraya, though cautious at first, began to answer, her voice carrying stories that painted vivid pictures of worlds beyond human reach, skies with 3 moons, oceans of crystal, and mountains that sang when the wind passed through them. And Leela would listen with wide eyes, sometimes falling asleep against Soraya's side while the alien brushed strands of hair gently from her face. And Elias, watching unseen from the doorway, felt a pang he had buried for years, a pang that reminded him of nights when his wife had once done the same, reading softly to their child before sickness carried her away. And though the memory brought grief, it also brought something else, an ache that longed for warmth he thought he no longer deserved. But the colony was not blind. Neighbors who passed near his farm slowed their carts and muttered, eyes lingering on the tall figure moving among his fields, whispers spreading that Elias had taken in a stranger not of their kind, some calling it dangerous, others calling it foolish. And one evening a group of men came to his fence, their faces tight with suspicion, torches in hand, demanding answers, their voices rising with anger as they warned him that keeping an alien so close could bring trouble upon them all. And though Elias stood firm, his jaw tight, his hand resting on the old rifle slung across his shoulder, it was not his voice that silenced them but Lila's, the little girl running to the gate and shouting that Soraya was not a threat, that she was family. And Soraya herself stood just behind her, tall yet calm, her glowing eyes meeting the men's with neither fear nor aggression. And something in her quiet dignity unsettled them more than if she had shouted, for they found no malice in her gaze, only a silent strength that made their anger falter. And at last they left, muttering but not daring to cross Elias's land that night. Still, the incident weighed heavy on Elias, for he knew whispers could grow into storms, and he asked himself if he was risking too much by letting her stay. But each time he considered asking her to leave, he saw Lila's laughter return, saw the girl run through the fields with joy he had thought lost forever, saw the alien kneeling in the dirt beside her teaching her how to weave shapes from wildflowers, or how to mend broken toys with careful hands, and his resolve would weaken. For how could he take that happiness away when it had been gone for so long? Yet even as trust began to grow between them, Elias could not quiet the soldier's instinct within him, the voice that whispered that peace never lasted, that danger always followed when least expected. And sometimes at night, he would stand at the window with his rifle near, watching the shadows where Soraya sat alone gazing at the stars, her silver eyes reflecting light as though searching for something far beyond his understanding. And though he wanted to ask what haunted her, what dangers might still come, he never spoke the words, keeping them locked behind his silence, because part of him feared that knowing the truth might shatter the fragile balance they had built. And so the days continued, trust growing not through grand gestures, but through small acts of care, through silent sacrifices, through the way Soraya rose before dawn to help in the fields, through the way Elias found himself leaving extra bread on the table without admitting it was for her, through the way Lila's laughter echoed brighter across the farm. And though suspicions still lingered in the colony beyond their fence, within the little home something was changing, something fragile but undeniable, as if the walls grief had built were slowly beginning to crack, and through those cracks, light was starting to enter once again, even as a shadow none of them could yet see crept closer across the stars, carrying the promise that their fragile peace would soon be tested, in ways none of them were ready for. Asterisk. The peace that had slowly taken root on Elias's farm began to tremble the day. The sky burned with streaks of light, distant yet unmistakable. For Soraya knew at once that they were not falling stars, but ships, and the moment her silver eyes fixed on them, a shadow of fear crossed her face, though she tried to hide it from Leela, who tugged her hand and asked if the stars were dancing. But Elias noticed the stiffness in her shoulders, the way her breath caught as though she had seen a ghost, and when he pressed her later in the barn, she confessed in a low, strained voice that the ships belonged to her people, the very ones who had cast her into exile, and if they had tracked her here it could only mean danger, for they would not allow her to live among humans. And the blood in Elias's veins ran cold because he understood the truth. This farm, this fragile family they had built, was no longer invisible, and soon they might all pay the price. The days that followed were heavy with tension. Elias watching the skies with the wary gaze of a soldier while Soraya kept to the shadows, her hands trembling when she thought no one was looking. And Leela, though too young to understand fully, sensed the unease and clung even closer to Soraya as though afraid she might vanish, whispering at night that she did not want her new mother to leave. And each time Soraya held her close and promised softly that she would never abandon her, though inside she was torn between the vow she wished to keep and the fear that forces stronger than her will might tear them apart. Then one evening, as the sun sank low and the sky burned red, the sound of engines shook the air, and a sleek vessel descended near the edge of the fields, its dark metal gleaming with markings Soraya recognized all too well, and from it emerged armored figures, tall and imposing, their movements sharp and disciplined, warriors of her kind whose eyes glowed like hers but colder, harder, and their leader stepped forward, voice echoing as he declared that the outcast Soraya must be surrendered, for she was a traitor and had no right to live freely among another race. And the villagers who had gathered at the commotion murmured with fear, some urging Elias to hand her over to avoid bloodshed, others simply backing away from the confrontation. But Elias stood firm at the gate, his rifle in hand, his face grim yet unyielding as he said that on his land no child of his would be torn from safety. And when the leader sneered and called Soraya nothing more than a burden, Leela broke free from her father's grip and ran to stand before Soraya, her small arms spread wide as she shouted that Soraya was her family, her mother, and that no one could take her away. And the courage in that tiny voice made the soldiers hesitate, if only for a moment, but it was enough to ignite something inside Soraya, a fire she had long buried, and she stepped forward, her silver eyes burning with resolve as she declared that she was no longer in exile, running from shadows, that she had found something worth standing for, and if her people wished to drag her away, they would have to face not just her but the humans she now called family. The tension crackled in the air like a storm about to break, the alien soldiers raising their weapons as Elias lifted his rifle, the villagers shifting uneasily as though caught between fear and the stirring sense of defiance, and for a moment, time seemed to hold its breath, the possibility of battle hanging sharp in the wind. Yet beneath the fear ran something stronger, the unspoken bond between a grieving father, a lonely child, and an outcast who had finally found belonging. And as Soraya stepped beside Elias, her glowing hand resting lightly on his arm, she whispered that she would not run again, and in his steady gaze she saw not doubt, but the steel of a man ready to protect his family, no matter the cost. And though the enemy before them was strong, the unity that held them together was stronger still, a force that promised that even if the night ahead was filled with danger, they would face it not as strangers but as one. The standoff at the farm stretched into silence, the alien soldiers shifting uneasily, while the fading light of the twin suns painted the sky with fire. And in that silence Elias felt the weight of every choice he had ever made pressing on his chest, for he knew that one wrong step could mean the end of his farm, his daughter, and the fragile bond they had built with Soraya. Yet when he looked at her standing beside him, her silver eyes steady and fearless though her hands trembled, he realized he was no longer just a soldier guarding his child. He was a man standing beside someone who had chosen to fight not for survival but for love. And when Lila's small voice rang out again, filled with defiance and innocence, as she clung to Soraya's cloak and declared she would not let anyone take her mother, something shifted among the crowd of villagers who had gathered at the edges of the field. For these people had known Elias as a stern, quiet man since the day his wife passed. But now they saw him stand openly in defense of an alien, saw a child's heart so certain in what was right, and saw an outcast who carried herself with dignity, even when facing those who once called her traitor. And in that moment the whispers of fear that had poisoned their minds gave way to murmurs of courage, for if Elias, who had once fought wars and carried scars from them, could choose to protect this stranger, perhaps she was not the danger they had feared. Still the soldiers pressed forward, their leader's voice sharp as he warned that protecting Sariah meant siding against her people, that defiance would bring consequences. But Elias did not flinch, his rifle steady as he replied that threats meant little to a man who had already lost everything once, and he would not lose it again. And though his voice was calm, it carried the weight of truth, and Sariah stepped closer, her hand brushing lightly against his arm as if to anchor herself. Then she raised her head and spoke to her former kin with a strength that surprised even her, saying she would not return to chains or to orders that demanded cruelty, that she had chosen this place, this family, this life, and no soldier's command would erase that. And her words, though quiet, echoed with something unshakable, and the leader who had come to drag her away hesitated, for he saw not fear in her but conviction, and conviction had a way of spreading like fire. The soldiers shifted uneasily, looking at one another as though unsure whether to force the matter, and then a murmur rose from the villagers who, emboldened by Elias's stand, stepped forward with tools and lanterns, not weapons of war but symbols of their willingness to protect their own. And suddenly the small farm was no longer just one man's home, but the heart of a community, unwilling to surrender what was right. And in that unity the alien warriors saw that even victory would come at great cost, and cost was not something they had expected from a quiet farming world. At last, with a cold glare, their leaders signaled retreat, warning that this matter was not finished, that Sariah's choice would have consequences far beyond this soil. And with the hiss of engines, they withdrew into the sky, leaving behind the echo of their threat, but also the proof that fear could be faced. When the night finally fell, silence lingered heavy on the fields, broken only by Lilla's soft sob as relief washed over her. And Sariah knelt to gather the child into her arms, whispering that she was safe, that she was here, while Elias stood nearby, lowering his rifle slowly, his chest rising with a mixture of exhaustion and pride. And when his eyes met Sariah's, he saw not the stranger he had once mistrusted, but the partner he had not realized he needed, someone who had fought beside him not with weapons, but with courage. And in that look something unspoken passed between them, a promise that though danger might come again, they would face it together. Days later, the villagers who had once whispered against Sariah began to greet her openly, some offering cautious thanks for the repairs she had done, others watching in quiet curiosity. And slowly the farm became more than just a refuge, it became a place of new beginnings, where a human soldier, his daughter, and an alien outcast found themselves no longer broken pieces, but parts of something whole. And though Sariah still gazed at the stars some nights with longing, she no longer felt alone beneath them, for now she had a hand in hers, a child's laughter in her ears, and the steady presence of a man who had chosen to trust again. And so, beneath the endless sky of twin suns, the three of them built not just a home but a family, fragile yet unshakable, born not of blood but of choice. And Lila, curling between them one quiet evening, whispered with the certainty of a child who had seen a dream made real, "See, I told you we could be a family." And neither Elias nor Sariah could find words, for none were needed, because in their hearts they knew it was true, and that truth, stronger than fear, stronger than exile, stronger than war, would carry them forward into whatever future awaited among the stars.